Good morning, I'm Joe Fryer.
And I'm Savannah Sellers. Right now on Morning News Now, sidelined. Johnson & Johnson's coronavirus vaccine will be on pause here in the U.S. for at least another week as the CDC gathers more information on potential health risks. What we now know about a possible link between the drug maker shot and those extremely rare blood clots. Out on bail, Kim Potter, the ex-police officer who fatally shot 20-year-old Daunte Wright during a traffic stop, has been charged with second-degree manslaughter. How local officials and activists are reacting to the charge as the trial of Derek Chauvin continues. Unprepared, Capitol Hill police were found to have ignored intelligence warnings in the days before the January 6th insurrection. We'll break down the scathing new watchdog report. And attention campers, summers of bug juice, campfires, and lake outings are slated to make a comeback after a tumultuous 2020 season rocked by the coronavirus. What's in store for kids this year once they arrive? And what are some of the precautions being taken to keep them safe? I think we're all looking forward to some somewhat normal celebratory summer activities.
Maybe we can have adult summer camp.
Yeah, really. Yeah, I'd sign up for that. And I'm sure many parents are quite excited about this.
A lot of wine at it.
Yeah. We'll get to that later in the show, but we begin with the latest on the Johnson & Johnson coronavirus vaccine.
The one-dose shot will be on pause for at least another week. A CDC advisory panel says it wants more information on the possible link between the vaccine and a rare type of blood clot. Johnson & Johnson says it's now looking into a possible seventh case. The 6 confirmed cases by the CDC involve women between the ages of 18 and 48. One woman from Virginia died. 4 others have not yet recovered. NBC News health and medical reporter Erica Edwards joins us now. So, Erica, again, this is a serious but rare side effect. Some of the experts on this advisory panel say they don't have enough information right now. What do they want to learn before making a decision about the future of J&J's vaccine?
Hi, Joe. Good morning. You're right. Many of those advisory panel members said they simply did not have enough data on the overall risk for these clotting issues. They know the risk is low, but how low? How best to treat these patients? As you said, these 6 cases were women between the ages of 18 and 48. But one panel member said that she actually suspects that these clotting issues may be underreported, underflagged, especially in people over age 50. So they want to cast a wider net on all age ranges. CDC Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky addressed the issues yesterday during a briefing.
Right now, we believe these events to be extremely rare, but we are also not yet certain we have heard about all possible cases, as this syndrome may not be easily recognized as one associated with the vaccine. CDC and FDA are working rapidly to investigate each case and understand whether there is a causal relationship between these blood clots and vaccine administration.
The panel is expected to reconvene in another week or so. Joe?
Erica, federal health officials are still investigating what could be the link between the vaccine and the rare blood clots, if anything. You spoke to experts about a possible connection. What did they tell you?
The leading theory right now is that it could be a key ingredient in the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that could explain the connection. So what the manufacturer did, they took a common cold virus, genetically modified it. So instead of giving a person a cold, it prompts the immune system to recognize the coronavirus's spike protein and then fight it. But in rare occasions, those instructions may be going awry, instead prompting the body's immune system to activate platelets, which we, of course, know cause blood clots. Now, AstraZeneca's vaccine also uses a similar technology, another cold virus. That vaccine, Joe, has been linked to blood clots in other countries.
Interesting. Now, Erica, we can't forget all this is happening while COVID cases are still rising nationwide, and lots of people are traveling right now. The CDC just released a study on the virus risk on planes, specifically with the middle seat. We know some airlines are no longer blocking that middle seat, but what do researchers think is the safe thing to do?
So according to the research from Kansas State, keeping that middle seat open can reduce the exposure to viral particles from anywhere from 23 to 57%. Now that makes sense, right? The farther you are from somebody, the less likely you are to inhale their potentially infectious droplets. Now, what this study did not take into account is mask wearing, which of course we know has been mandated on flights since January. So that means the study may have actually overestimated the benefits of keeping that middle seat open. By the way, Delta is the last airline to block the middle seat, but that will end May 1st. Joe?
All right, Erica, thank you so much.
Now to new developments out of Minnesota, where overnight about 24 people were arrested in Brooklyn Center near Minneapolis for the 4th straight night of protests following the death of Daunte Wright. Last night's demonstrations, though, were significantly smaller than the days before. Earlier on Wednesday, the former officer who shot and killed Wright was arrested and charged with second-degree manslaughter. Kim Potter posted bond and has been released. Meanwhile, in a Minneapolis courtroom, more testimony in the murder trial of Derek Chauvin in the death of George Floyd as the defense calls an expert witness to the stand. For more on all that, I want to bring in NBC News correspondent Shaquille Brewster joining us from Minneapolis. Shaq, good morning. Now, it's been less than a week since Daunte Wright was shot and killed, and already the officer has resigned and been arrested and charged. Walk us through how all of this happened and what officials are saying right now.
Yes, Van, a lot of change in Brooklyn Center fairly quickly. You saw initially that police chief, he released the body camera video within 24 hours. Then you saw the resignations from the town manager, the police chief, and then from the actual officer who was involved in the shooting. And then you saw yesterday the charges against that officer. I want you to listen to what the Washington County attorney said when announcing those charges against the officer.
Is it your opinion that Mr. Chauvin's knee in any way impacted the structures of Mr. Floyd's neck?
I will read instead. That was not it. That was from the trial. But he said, we will vigorously prosecute this case and intend to prove that Officer Potter abrogated her responsibility to protect the public when she used her firearm rather than her taser. He goes on to say her action caused the unlawful killing of Mr. Wright and that she must be held accountable. So she has been booked. She was processed. She was released on a $100,000 bail just yesterday. I believe we have some mugshot photos that we can show you there. But you see, this moved fairly quickly. Despite that, you still see the protests. You still see the demonstrations. As you mentioned, many arrests last night in Brooklyn Center, Savannah.
Yeah, Shaq, thanks for rolling there with that sound mix-up. And actually, we'll get to that in just a moment when we talk about the trial of Derek Chauvin. But I want to stay on what's going on in Brooklyn Center for just a moment. There's been a mixed reaction about the second-degree manslaughter charge against Kim Potter, the officer who did fire her weapon. What are you hearing?
That's right. We heard from the family of Daunte Wright, his brother, the fact that people are still coming out. This is a charge that we've seen other officers face before. It has had some success. It has not had some success in other cases. So it's definitely something that still drives those emotions. I think the bottom line and the message that you hear from many people in the community is that it's not just about one individual action. It's about the distrust with the police department. It's the frustration that this is something that feels like it's happening over and over and over again.
Absolutely. Lots going on there. Thank you for the updates on that part of this, Shaq. Now let's turn to the murder trial of Derek Chauvin and some of that sound that we just heard a moment ago. So we're starting to see exactly what you've been talking about, Shaq, for about a week or so now, which is this sort of battle of the experts. And yesterday, the defense called a retired chief medical examiner to the stand. Tell us more about his testimony and what we heard both from him on the defense and then as well as during that cross-examination.
Dr. David Fowler, he was the chief medical expert or medical examiner in the state of Maryland for about 17 years, Savannah. And he came and took the stand and he really contradicted. He provided a countering view to what we heard over the past 2 weeks from the prosecutors' experts and the witnesses that they put forward. For one, he said that he would have ruled the death instead of a homicide, which it was classified as here in Hennepin County. He would have said it was undetermined. He also had several different factors that he threw in. He said the main cause of death was that Floyd had a sudden cardiac arrhythmia and blamed it on his heart disease that happened during the restraint and subdual by officers rather than that was caused by the restraint and subdual of the officers. I believe we have that sound ready to play. Let's play some of the testimony that we heard yesterday.
Is it your opinion that Mr. Chauvin's knee in any way impacted the structures of Mr. Floyd's neck?
No, it did not. None of the vital structures were in the area where the knee appeared to be from the videos.
one of the other factors that he raised, the potential factors, he said there was a potential for carbon monoxide poisoning as Floyd was being restrained there near the tailpipe of that car. On the cross-examination, you heard the prosecution ask, did you even find out if the car was on? And Dr. Fowler said no, that was something that he asked, and he assumed based on some liquid that was on the ground that the car was running, but he didn't know the details of the car or what kind of specific car that was. So you saw a really intense cross-examination as this doctor did what he was brought to do, which was try to introduce doubt into the narrative that the prosecution has been spending the previous 2 weeks laying out.
Chuck, one other detail that we learned yesterday is that a potential key witness for the defense will not be testifying. Tell us who that person is and why he won't be taking the stand.
Yeah, that's right. This is something that happened before the jury was brought in initially. It was Maurice Hall. He was the passenger in George Floyd's vehicle when the initial interaction happened with officers. If you got to see any of that body camera video, you saw him with a white shirt, I believe, and at least a red hat in that interaction. And his attorney essentially came up and said that if he was compelled to testify, he would invoke his Fifth Amendment protections, because if you listen to the defense, they are arguing and suggesting that he provided George Floyd with drugs. So because of that, the judge heard arguments. The judge agreed with Mr. Hall and his attorney and said he was going to quash his subpoena. He was not going to require him to come up in front of the jury and essentially say, I plead the fifth over and over, based on the questions that the defense attorney was planning to ask him. So we will not see from Maurice Hall, which means the defense presentation, their witnesses and their witness list is going to be shorter than what we expected. It is possible, Savannah, that today is the last day of testimony from the defense.
All right, Shaq, thank you so much.
Let's go straight to NBC News legal analyst Danny Civallo. So, Danny, first of all, what is your take on this second-degree manslaughter charge against former officer Kim Potter? Is this the charge you expected?
It is one of the lower homicide charges, but the reality is, in criminal defense, everything is about the code, the language of the code. And this is an unusual factual situation. When you look at the Minnesota code, manslaughter in the second degree is when somebody, by culpable negligence, which is a kind of recklessness, an awareness of the risk, causes a death of another, takes an unreasonable risk, and consciously takes the chances of causing the death. And I can see a jury getting hung up on that consciousness element, because what was it that she consciously created the risk about? I mean, she believed, and she maybe unreasonably, but believed she was grabbing for her gun. I can see that being a little difficult. And this is one of the lowest level homicides in the Minnesota code. So this may be an appropriate charge in that it may reflect the prosecution's view of her intent, which was not specific intent to kill, but it may also be a charge that is defensible because of the language of the statute.
Danny, I want to talk about something Reverend Al Sharpton said after the charge was announced yesterday. Let's listen to that.
Manslaughter 2 is the least she should get. The least, possibly more. When you look at the fact that you're dealing with a 26-year veteran, if she didn't know in 26 years the difference in size and weight of a gun as opposed to a taser, then how was she a veteran in policing?
Now, we've reported that the Brooklyn Center police chief, now former chief, believed the shooting of Daunte Wright was accidental and that Officer Potter meant to use her taser, not her gun. How do you think these arguments are going to play out in court?
I think we're going to go to the tape, just like we did in the Derek Chauvin case. And there does appear, at least initially, to be evidence that she didn't intend to use her firearm. She intended to use her taser. In fact, she appears to be calling out or warning folks that she is using the taser, which contains an electrical current, before she pulls what she thinks is the taser and ends up being the firearm. So this case is all going to come down to scrutinizing whether or not it's even remotely reasonable to accidentally grab for your firearm, depending on where it is, as opposed to the taser. So in this case, there appears to be some evidence that this was an unintentional killing. But of course, as we've seen in the Derek Chauvin case, there are unintentional killings that can rise to the level of murder. But the prosecution in this case so far believes it is only the unintentional manslaughter variety of homicide.
Yeah, quickly, Danny, how does the Potter case compare with the Chauvin case? In what ways for the prosecution could it be easier to get a conviction, and in what ways could it be harder?
In one way, they are similar in that they are probably both admittedly unintentional killings. These are not, Derek Chauvin is not charged with intentional murder. But on the other hand, this is a situation where the officer Potter did something that she didn't think she was doing. Derek Chauvin knew he was putting a knee on the back of the neck of George Floyd. So far, it appears that Officer Potter believed she was doing one thing and ended up doing the other thing. That's why this fact situation doesn't fit neatly into some of the traditional definitions of homicide, and particularly this definition as the Minnesota legislature has chosen to define second-degree manslaughter.
Danny, appreciate your expertise this morning. Thank you so much.
New this morning from Washington, we're expecting the Biden administration to announce long-expected Russia sanctions today, according to one U.S. official and a second source familiar with the matter. I want to go straight to NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memoli for more on that. Mike, good morning. So what do we know so far about the sanctions?
Good morning, Savannah. We expect the Biden administration this afternoon to announce sanctions on 20 Russian entities, as well as the expulsion of 10 Russians from the United States. All of this following a months-long review of how to respond to Russian behavior, both the SolarWinds cyber hack, the ongoing election interference in 2016 and 2020, as well as the bounties Russia ordered on U.S. forces serving in Afghanistan. Now, Bloomberg News, which was first to report these sanctions, also reports that the U.S. is set to deploy what is called the nuclear option of sanctions, which would bar U.S. financial institutions from investing in Russian debt. This is a significant development that already follows the sanctions the U.S. had placed on Russia following the poisoning of opposition leader Alexei Navalny.
Mike, let's now turn to Afghanistan. Yesterday, the president announced his plans to withdraw all troops by September 11th. And we've also learned just in the last hour that Secretary of State Antony Blinken has made a surprise visit there. What's the reaction, Ben, to this decision? And what will the administration do? What are they saying they're going to do to ensure stability in the region moving forward?
Well, we just got perhaps the most significant reaction to the U.S. decision. That's from the Afghan President Ghani, who, upon meeting with Secretary of State Blinken today in Kabul, said we respect the U.S. decision and we are adjusting our priorities. That's a very diplomatic way of saying that they're not necessarily happy. But even as the U.S. announced this decision yesterday, they're acknowledging that there were no easy decisions, especially as it relates to the security of Afghanistan. Take a listen to what the CIA director told lawmakers on Capitol Hill yesterday.
There is a significant risk once the U.S. military and the coalition militaries withdraw, but we will work very hard at CIA and with all of our partners to try to provide the kind of strategic warning to others in the U.S. government that enables them and us to address that threat if it starts to materialize.
One big question that hasn't been answered yet, and which the administration is acknowledging is still to come, is what kind of presence will the U.S. have to maintain in order to ensure the protection of our U.S. diplomatic facilities, especially the embassy in Kabul? We'll wait and see for that announcement later this year.
Lots to watch for on the international stage this morning. Mike, thank you for covering it all.
Thank you.
Time for the belated birthday edition of your Morning News Now weather.
Bill Cairns, how was your day?
I would highly recommend everyone take their birthday off if it's sunny and 70 degrees.
If it's today, though, don't do it. Don't bother.
Yeah, I feel horrible for all the April 15th birthdays in the Northeast and down in the Gulf Coast. It's ugly, and I apologize. But yeah, I got lucky. I won the lottery, and yeah, the weather guy took the day off on a beautiful day on his birthday. So
you deserved it.
All right, so thank you, and let's get to this forecast because there is some ugly weather out there this morning. Let's turn our attention first to what could be life-threatening weather, and that's with flash flooding that's underway down along the Gulf Coast. We've had a lot of rain in the last couple of days. I mean, when you see the white, that's the clouds. The radar is the green. Inside of the green, if it's really heavy rain, we have like the yellow and the oranges. And then there's these little white things. I put lightning bolts on our maps to show you where it's actually current lightning strikes. I mean, there are hundreds, if not thousands of lightning strikes right now with this line of storms moving through Louisiana. Baton Rouge, you're clear, but this is all heading to New Orleans in the next hour or two. We have a flood watch that's in effect. We have one area right around Biloxi that's under a flash flood warning, so be careful driving around there early this morning. And it's just going to be kind of nasty right through today into tomorrow. 2 to 3 inches of rain an hour is possible with these storms as it moves on along the northern Gulf Coast today. So how about the cruel mid-April weather we're going to see later on tonight in areas of the Northeast? Winter storm warnings in New Hampshire, a good section of Vermont, western Massachusetts, too. I mean, it's not just going to snow. I mean, it may be heavy snow. That's the possibility in the Green Mountains, up to 9 to 12 inches of snow. And that could cause some isolated power outages. And also there's that rain for other areas in the Northeast. So, yeah, little wild weather out there as we go throughout this mid-April day.
Wild is right. We're so over snow. All right, Bill, thank you so much. See you next hour.
Yes. Okay.
Coming up, tens of thousands of vaccine doses are now up for grabs in Mississippi.
But residents just aren't lining up to receive them. We will tell you why next.
In the news this Thursday morning, Democrats will introduce legislation to expand the Supreme Court from 9 justices to 13. Progressives have been pushing for the move after 3 conservative justices joined the court in the last 4 years. Among former President Trump's picks, the highly controversial appointment of Amy Coney Barrett right before the election. The bill, however, is unlikely to pass due to the Democrats' slim majority in Congress. Former Bachelor star Colton Underwood has revealed that he is gay. During a pre-taped interview with Good Morning America, Colton said that he hated himself for a long time before coming out, but now he's the happiest and healthiest he has ever been. Variety reports that Underwood, a former pro football player, will star in a new Netflix reality show, which will focus on him living his life publicly as a gay man. And fans of the Harry Potter series know that Professor Snape always wanted that job teaching defense against the dark arts. Well, you could maybe argue he got it, but we're talking about a different Professor Snape, a Dr. Matthew Snape, who teaches at Oxford, and instead of fighting the dark arts, he's fighting COVID. He recently led a study on coronavirus vaccines in the UK. Of course, it did not take long for the internet to compare him to the professor from Harry Potter. The University of Oxford even tweeted, "We'd like to confirm our Snape is not a dark arts professor. He mostly works in pediatrics and vaccinology." Very different. The professor also told a paper in the UK this isn't the first time he has been jokingly mistaken for the fictional character. Again, he's working on the good arts, the bright arts.
Definitely the good arts. Also, it's kind of funny hearing you say Matthew Snape, because isn't his name Severus Snape in the movie? Right. It's just so dramatically different. But Matthew Snape, the good doctor.
Now, if his name was Severus, that would be
then
something.
we might have some more questions. All right, Joe, thanks so much. Now, as the nationwide race to vaccinate gains speed, one state appears to be lagging behind. In Mississippi, only a third of all residents have received at least one dose, even though appointments and vaccine supplies seem to be readily available. MSNBC's Yasmin Vasugian joins us now from a vaccine site in Mississippi. Yasmin, good morning. Good to see you. So it seems like if supply is there and appointments are there, this is potentially a vaccine hesitancy issue. Is that the case? And if so, why is it so high in this specific state?
Yeah, I mean, going into Tuesday, the supply was certainly there, right? There was about 70,000 plus open slots in the state of Mississippi. Think about that for a moment. But you think about the makeup overall of the state, 40% of this state are Black Americans. On top of that, you got a lot of white conservative men. Those are the 2 predominant groups of folks that have the highest degree of vaccine hesitancy, specifically in this state, but also across the nation as well. This state was hard hit financially by the pandemic over the last year. So a lot of folks are not willing to take time off of their jobs to sign up for a vaccine to come out and get this vaccine. This is also an incredibly rural state. If you could see around me, honestly, there's not a lot. I mean, I'm in front of a healthcare facility, but you see one house and then for miles and miles, you don't see another house. So it's incredibly rural. It's tough to get to areas to actually get this vaccine. There's also a lack of trust in the government, as I've been hearing from folks. And a lot of people in these rural communities, they don't have access to internet. So they can't physically sign on and sign up for some of these open vaccine slots, and they don't actually know what's going on. So all of these things together, Savannah, are happening simultaneously at the same time. And so folks are having a hard time getting the vaccine out. But there's certainly a lot of ground game happening to promote the vaccine and get folks the clinics and get those shots in arms.
So, Yasmin, one of the things that we know about the Johnson & Johnson shot is the fact that it was this one dose and it didn't need to be kept at those extremely cold special temperatures, meant that it was easier to get to rural communities. It meant that it was the ideal vaccine for a mobile clinic, for example, to get out to those people who do live further away from any of these medical centers. What's the pause in that particular vaccine done to these communities?
It's tough. It's really hit them hard. And you actually put it perfectly. I mean, it is ideal for a community like this for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's Johnson & Johnson. It's brand recognition, right? Johnson & Johnson makes the baby shampoo that we've all known for decades. And literally, it's brand recognition. And a lot of people know Johnson & Johnson. They don't know Moderna. They don't know Pfizer. So they opted for Johnson & Johnson. They wanted to wait for Johnson & Johnson. Also, it's a one-shot deal because it's a rural community. It costs $25, $30. It's a lot of money for folks out here to get to a clinic to actually get the shot. So if they only have to do that once, it's a lot more of an incentive than to have to come back twice. Also, if they're already hesitant, as we were talking about a little bit earlier, it's easier to sign up mentally for one shot than it is to sign up for two. And I heard that a lot over and over. I actually spoke to one woman yesterday, Pam Chapman. She is the head of Boss Lady Workforce. It's an organization essentially trying to organize folks to get to these clinics to get the shots, providing transportation, providing incentives, Visa cards, essentially, that will give them $25, $30 to get to these clinics to get the shots in arms, and also educating folks on the ground in some of these rural communities about these shots to encourage them to get the vaccine so we can all reach herd immunity. She talked to me about that day on Tuesday when we heard from the CDC and the FDA essentially saying we're going to pause the further release of Johnson & Johnson. And she said it really put a wrench in their efforts going forward. Let's take a listen to Pam.
Yesterday was almost like the worst day of my life. We were all excited because we had so many people committed to taking the J&J. And as soon as we informed them that they had taken it off the shelves, they panicked. Everybody left. They canceled their appointments. We had local industries that had committed to bringing their employees over to get vaccinated, and no one wanted it. That not that they just said, I don't want it. They just didn't want it, and they didn't want to take Moderna. They were out. Why? I think people say one shot is enough. A lot of people are afraid of needles. A lot of people are afraid of what the government is doing. They feel like they're going to be statistic, used for data. And so they just don't want to do it. They said one time is just enough for us, just one time.
So, Savannah, it's interesting. I was actually interviewing Pam in a church, right? She specifically asked if we could meet at a church. And one of the reasons is it's all about the church, right? She mentioned to me this is essentially the Bible Belt. We all know that. A lot of folks rely on their church leaders for education, for guidance in situations like this. So the community, the local government, I spoke to the mayor yesterday as well, they are engaging church leaders to help educate their parishioners about getting this vaccine, how to get it, where to get it, when to get it. And Pam has really been engaging the church and the leaders in the church to help educate folks on the ground and identify folks in rural communities. Because if you think about it, I mean, you don't even know where people live out here. It is so rural. So they have to understand who actually needs it, who is homebound, who is elderly, and who they need to communicate with to actually get this vaccine. It's tough. But it is a community effort, and there's a major ground game, as I mentioned earlier, going on. They have billboards. They are handing out flyers. They're door knocking, and they're going to continue to door knock with a lot of these folks, even though these folks wanted the Johnson & Johnson to say, listen, we have Moderna until they make a decision going forward on Johnson & Johnson, Savannah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so great to hear them engaging those church leaders. I mean, what a great way to actually encourage people in places that they are actually comfortable. Is that the main thing that officials are doing there to try to instill more confidence?
Absolutely. That is the main thing. And then it is really just educating folks. I mean, Pam is a well-known commodity in this community. There's another woman I spoke to who was actually one of the first coaches of the WNBA, and she actually works in the healthcare system here now. So a lot of folks see her as a celebrity. And so they're engaging people that people recognize, right? People that are somewhat famous in this area, that grew up here, that went out and made a big career for themselves and then returned home to work with their communities. And they're relying on them to help educate folks about this vaccine and hope to encourage them to come out and get this vaccine. But of course, it always goes back to the church in areas, especially like Mississippi, Savannah.
Absolutely. Great ways to continue to instill confidence while we deal with these other issues with Johnson & Johnson. Yasmin, thank you so much.
NBC News medical contributor Dr. Kavita Patel joins us now. So, Dr. Patel, we just heard from Yasmin about vaccine hesitancy in Mississippi. It was already an issue before the Johnson & Johnson news. So what can we do now to address vaccine concerns?
Yeah, Joe, we're all still trying to work it out in real time. I think the first message is that the safety process and kind of the oversight that we had hoped we would always see but had never had to test like we do now is working. So 6 cases, possibly a 7th case, but that's out of 7 million shots. The pause is still being extended. That does make very obvious, Joe, there's 2 other vaccines that have had none of these blood clots to date associated. And we've had almost 100 million of those shots going out. So I think just reassuring people, yes, 1 dose certainly sounds more convenient, but wouldn't it be incredibly great to prevent death, prevent hospitalizations, and give yourself peace of mind? And we're replacing those appointments with Moderna and Pfizer actively. We tried really hard not to cancel anything. And I think most people around the country are doing the same.
That's good to hear. Now, it looks like it will be at least another week before we find out what's next for the J&J 1-dose shot. The CDC advisory panel wants more information on those 6 cases of rare blood clots. What do you want to know?
Yeah, here's what I want to know. I think that what came out yesterday was incredibly important for physicians such as myself. We want to know what to look for in patients, how to have our threshold up. We got that information yesterday. We also want to have very quickly, what should we be doing to treat these patients? I actually see what the CDC discussed, to be honest, Joe, very directed both towards people who receive the vaccines as well as to those of us in clinical settings who need to be able to understand. But then the other thing I would like to know, Joe, is this really seen like we saw in Europe with AstraZeneca, kind of recommended for a different age group? Maybe we'll say that this is limited to 50 and older, just like they're doing in other countries. That's the kind of information that I suspect the CDC is going to be wrestling with over the next several weeks. Good news in the United States, at least, we have enough of the other 2 vaccines so that we don't depend on that decision. But for the world, it's a different matter, Joe. And to Yasmin's point, we still have parts of this country that do depend on having a one-shot approach.
And we can't forget that. Dr. Patel, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Let's now take a look at what's making news around the world this morning. There it is.
NBC's Raf Sanchez joins us from London. Good morning, Raf.
Joe, Savannah, good morning. Members of the royal family are taking to social media to share some never-before-seen pictures of Prince Philip ahead of his funeral. One photo showing the Queen and Prince Philip surrounded by 7 of their great-grandchildren, including Prince George, the future king. The picture taken by George's mother, Kate, also known as the Duchess of Cambridge. In Japan, fishermen are worried about a plan to release water from the Fukushima disaster site. About 1.3 million tons of contaminated water will be released into the sea. Japan's government says it's safe, it's been treated, but fishermen concerns the public won't want to buy fish that's been in that water. And finally, in France, President Emmanuel Macron has visited Notre Dame exactly 2 years after the fire that tore through the iconic cathedral. The president hopes to have the cathedral repaired by 2024, but some experts say it may take longer. But guys, just the sight of those repairs may offer some hope after what's really been a difficult couple of years in France.
I can't believe it's been 2 years since that fire. That's one of those things that hits you where you realize we've been on pause for a year, so you forget everything that's happened. Yeah,
exactly. All right. Thank you, Raf.
Coming up, a damning new report surrounding the January 6th insurrection.
It appears that Capitol Hill police ignored critical intelligence warnings ahead of the riots. We'll tell you more next.
As we approach 100 days since the deadly riot on Capitol Hill, a new report by the U.S. Capitol Police Inspector General found that Capitol Police ignored critical intelligence ahead of the January 6th riot, including a warning that, quote, Congress itself is the target. With more on the findings from this watchdog report, NBC News correspondent for investigations, Tom Winter, and NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent, Leanne Caldwell, join us now. Good morning to both of you. So, Tom, first, let me go straight to you to just help us understand the key findings of this report. What do they mean? What did they ignore? What have we learned?
Right. So there were a couple of things that were focused on. Obviously, the response that day, the intelligence leading up to it, and then kind of a retrospective look at the training and the background of what was put into play for a situation like this. I want to read to you the first sentence of the intelligence assessment, Savannah. It says, due to the tense political environment following the 2020 election, the threat of disruptive actions or violence cannot be ruled out. That's the very first sentence. And then it goes on, as you said, to say that it wasn't going to be counter protesters, as was typically the case at Trump rallies where things might have gotten violent, but it was in fact Congress itself that was the target. It was a detailed intelligence assessment that included social media posts and findings from all sorts of various intelligence products. And as we reported previously, Savannah, and as we've discussed before, the NYPD sent down 4 packets of information about what they found on social media. There were FBI warnings, this infamous FBI Norfolk warning, which was included in full in this Inspector General's report yesterday. So I think it's important to know, a lot of people said this was an intelligence failure. It appears, looking at this, it was perhaps, in the analysis of it by people in law enforcement, not so much an intelligence failure as it was a failure to imagine what could occur, and also a failure to properly have enough National Guard there, Savannah.
Leanne, you hear a warning like Congress itself is the target. I mean, that's chilling. What's the reaction been like on Capitol Hill?
Well, Savannah, the official U.S. Capitol Police did put out a statement in response to this report, and it was actually pretty conciliatory. It wasn't extremely defensive, which is what I was expecting. And they wrote acknowledging that there were mistakes that were made. And this is what they wrote. The department fully agrees with many of the recommendations it has received from the task force and the Office of Inspector General. It's also aware that nearly all of the recommendations require time and significant resources the department does not have. So it is putting some pressure on Congress to provide the resources it needs in order to do its job. But Savannah, I do want to say one current senior law enforcement official at Capitol Police did remind me and wanted this point to be known, that actually there were mistakes made. The Capitol Police did do its job. The only goal of Capitol Police is to keep members of Congress safe. Not one member of Congress was hurt on that day, and everyone was safely evacuated. Savannah.
It is something to remember and to be thankful for. Now, Leanne, the Capitol Police Inspector General Michael Bolton, who prepared this report, is set to testify before a House committee today. What might we anticipate from this hearing? What details will he likely be pressed on from this?
Yeah, well, there are going to be lots of questions from members of Congress, of course. They are likely going to want to know why the decision was made to present a posture to deal with First Amendment protesters, something that happens often on Capitol Hill. Obviously, that is not what the January 6th riot was. So they will be pressed on that. And I expect members of Congress to ask a lot of questions about what specifically Capitol Hill or Capitol Police need from Congress in order to better do its job, Savannah.
Now, Tom, we hear that they knew before that there could be violence, that Congress itself is the target. I mean, what are we going to hear about how to stop this from happening again? How do we ensure the security of Capitol Hill moving forward?
Well, right. Well, I think the Inspector General came up with a couple of different suggestions, and we can take a look at some of the key findings on screen. But I think when you look at it, they're going to be focused on, one, what are the training here? So were they properly trained? There were some real gaps that the Inspector General found as far as how often Capitol Police officers were trained in handling these types of situations on what we saw on January 6th, what type of equipment that they had as far as preparing for non-lethal type rounds, non-lethal type ammunition. Some of the stuff that they hadn't even been used in a while and was obsolete. So even if they needed it, it wasn't something that anybody was prepared to use. Talking about streamlining the intelligence unit, obviously getting more information to more people in a more quick fashion, more rapid fashion. That's obviously important. And they talked about adding security clearances as well so officers can review that. There's a lot of folks in law enforcement that might take issue with that a little bit, Savannah, and essentially say, look, you don't need more people reading all these raw reports. You need more people reacting to the information that you have, and you need the commanders to really stand behind their officers on the front lines and give them the tools that they need.
Tom, before I let you go, just very quickly, I know you have new reporting regarding the Capitol Police officer who fatally shot a rioter. What is that?
right? So the Justice Department yesterday came out with a press release and a statement saying that they're not going to charge that officer in the death of 35-year-old Ashley Babbitt. She was shot and killed trying to break into one of the sections of Congress near the House chamber. They essentially said in the law here, particularly in light of case precedent, what the Supreme Court has ruled, that when you try to bring a type of civil rights violation, which is what they were apparently, according to the press release, a path that they were looking towards from a standpoint of a prosecution, anytime an officer believed or had a reasonable basis to believe their life was in danger, certainly a member of Congress's life could have been in danger. We saw that. Leanne talked about it, that it would be very difficult for them to meet the elements that they would need to bring forward a prosecution. So as a result, they're not going to bring charges very quickly. Savannah, we've continually asked for that officer's name for additional information about that incident and continue to get no response from the Capitol Police. It's an area of transparency. The audience can decide whether or not it's appropriate for us to have this little information this far out from that shooting.
That's a great point. Tom and Leanne, so much good information. Thank you so much.
Now to our network-wide series, American Extremism. Last year, an angry mob, including armed militia groups, tried to get inside Michigan's state capitol as they protested COVID restrictions. Law enforcement officials say that event may have paved the way for the alleged plot to try to kidnap Michigan's governor. The suspects in that case are now awaiting trial. NBC News correspondent Stephanie Goss joins us now from Detroit with a closer look at what happened in Michigan. Stephanie, good morning.
Hey, Joe, good morning to you. I sat down with a former U.S. attorney, Matthew Schneider, and he investigated for 20 years motorcycle gangs and militia in eastern Michigan, prosecuted him. He's no longer in that office, which is why he was able to sit down with us and provide us new detail on a domestic terror case that shocked the country. Angry protesters at the Capitol confronting police and demanding to be let inside. But this isn't Washington, D.C. This is Lansing, Michigan, a year ago. A rally organized to protest COVID restrictions, with members of the state's militia groups openly taking part. What happened here was less violent than what took place at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. There were some scuffles and one arrest. But according to law enforcement, a seed was planted. Among a small group of people, a plan was taking shape to do something much, much worse. The alleged plan was to kidnap the governor and put her on trial for treason, all because of Michigan's COVID lockdown.
When that rally took place in Lansing, I was very concerned about some of the people attending because I knew who they were. Former U.S. Attorney Matthew Schneider was part of the state and federal investigative team, now speaking publicly about the case for the first time. They had been watching the group called the Wolverine Watchmen for a while. By the fall, more than a dozen men would be arrested for the alleged plot. One man pleaded guilty, the rest not guilty. At what point do you switch from, okay, this is just a harebrained idea, they're just talking, to they're getting prepared to commit a crime? Right. Well, that is the critical point for law enforcement. When I saw that the folks had actually taken some steps, for example, to go and look under a bridge to see if that was a place that they could put explosives to deter law enforcement from coming. That this wasn't just talk. Correct. According to the indictment, some of the planning happened here at this unlikely home in the rural town of Munich. The group allegedly used the property for tactical training. Target practice on the tires and that kind of thing. Anything. Janice Kitley is the township clerk. What was the community's reaction to these charges? Well, they were horrified and embarrassed. Authorities seized an arsenal of weapons, hundreds of guns, thousands of rounds of ammunition, explosives, and artillery shells. It's one thing to have a gun because guns are protected under the Constitution. Explosive devices are not. Do you think a high-profile trial like this one, and potentially these defendants have found guilty going to prison, do you think that that will limit the number of threats out there? Well, we can hope so. But it sounds like you're not sure it will necessarily. There is no doubt that there will be future acts of domestic terrorism in America. What we need to do is minimize that number, to bring that number down. A problem, he says, not just for Michigan, but for the whole country. Okay. So one of the most troubling parts of the indictment and the criminal complaint is a section that describes a meeting that took place back in June that was attended not only by the Wolverine Watchmen, but at least 13 other militiamen from other states. And in that meeting, they talked not just about
kidnapping the governor of Michigan, but of doing the same thing to other governors. So I specifically asked Schneider about that moment, and I said, do you think that that risk is still there? He said to me, I think the risk is now even greater. Guys, back to you.
Important reporting. Stephanie, thank you so much. Coming up, the mastermind behind the nation's biggest Ponzi scheme, Bernie Madoff, has died.
A look at the legacy he's left behind next.
Bernie Madoff, the notorious mastermind behind the largest Ponzi scheme in American history, has died in federal prison. He was 82 years old. Madoff was once chairman of NASDAQ, a Wall Street icon. It's before he was arrested in 2008 for an elaborate financial scheme that bilked thousands of investors out of about $65 billion. His investors, the true victims of the crimes, lost their savings without any warning. A year later, Madoff pleaded guilty to 11 federal crimes and was sentenced to 150 years in prison. NBC News senior business correspondent Stephanie Ruhle joins us now. So, Stephanie, when you say the name Bernie Madoff, you think of the words Ponzi scheme, a term many of us did not even know until 2008. Remind us, what did Madoff do and how did he get away with it for so long?
Joe, it was a classic and massive Ponzi scheme, all based on getting new investors in the game. He never actually invested their money. He would take new investors' money and give it as returns to long-standing investors. And the game was get more and more investors in over time. And he did it with tens of thousands of clients. He was able to do this for decades. And because it was a private business, there aren't shareholders, there aren't outside investors who are analyzing all the moves of this company. He got away with it until 2008 when his own sons, his two children, turned him into the federal government. His wife, Ruth, who was with him since they were in high school, she didn't even know.
Stephanie, what happened to the victims, the investors who Bernie Madoff stole from?
Listen, they lost everything in some cases. There were over 37,000 victims, and they range from very well-known celebrities, Steven Spielberg, Larry King, Kevin Bacon, the owner of the New York Mets, to an awful lot of people who had their entire life savings, their retirement income invested with Madoff. And you said it a moment ago, $65 billion lost overnight. And to put into context, the emotional toll it took, the financial toll on many of these people. Last year, Bernie Madoff's attorneys requested from the judge compassionate early release because of his poor health. Over 100 of his victims wrote in and explained that they had lost everything, explained the dire impact on their lives. I mean, just yesterday, NBC spoke to one of his victims after his death was announced, and he said death was too good for Bernie Madoff.
Wow. Understandable, strong reaction. Stephanie Ruhle, thank you so much. Appreciate that.
Arts and crafts, s'mores, and time outdoors. Sleepaway camp can be a vital part of growing up. But like many things in 2020, so many kids were robbed of that experience. NBC News investigative correspondent Vicki Nguyen takes a look at the safety measures sleepaway camps are putting in place to reduce the COVID-19 risk for campers this year.
For many kids, summer means camp, swimming, hiking, being outside, and making new friends. But in 2020, an estimated 82% of camps across the country were put on pause to help curb the spread of COVID-19. Camp Wildwood in Maine was one of the few that managed to open. Camp director Lewis Kale says they used a comprehensive safety plan based on public health guidelines.
Once we understood a little bit what we were doing from the medical side, we were able to jump into this full throttle.
They called on camp mom and pediatrician Deb, Franz, and Frederick.
What made it so safe? We had 0 COVID cases, and I think what really made it successful for us was an early on partnership with the families.
Before camp even started, Wildwood told campers and their families what to expect. A 2-week quarantine before arrival, daily symptom screenings at home, testing before and during the camp session, and masks. Once campers and staff arrived, they created a bubble. No one in or out.
The directors were very committed to ensuring that the families were on board.
Most camps are expected to open this summer using the safety lessons they learned from last summer. I'm here at Trailblazers Summer Camp in New Jersey. It's a sleepaway camp to show you what campers should expect. Riel Pierre-Booms is the executive director.
And what do you say to parents about how safe it's going to be?
We are certainly very confident in how safe we can make it. We're going to be outside essentially 95% of the time.
Symptom screenings, masks, and testing will also be required.
There'll be a testing regimen that will include testing prior to arrival in camp, testing upon arrival, and then testing throughout the experience while they're here.
To limit the potential spread of illness, campers will be grouped into pods, 8 children and 2 counselors that will live, eat, and play together.
Activities are a big part of camp. How do you keep everybody safe in between the rotations?
Archery is a camp favorite at camp, right? Kids love to be here. Like any other area in camp, no more than 1 group at a time. After a visit, counselors will be trained to make sure they sanitize all the equipment.
Unlike years past, no visitors allowed and no big camp-wide events.
The sing-alongs will happen, but the groups will be separated appropriately.
And whenever possible, equipment will not be shared among the pods.
This is a new wood shop where kids get taught basic woodworking skills. The big difference this year is that each pod will have their own set of tools.
As for snacks and meal times,
Riel, you have this beautiful crackling campfire. Normally you've got diners in here. What are you going to do with the space this year?
Yeah, so usually this is a space that would hold upwards of 100 people dining together, and that's not something we'll be able to do this year. If they absolutely have to come inside, they'll come into the space fully distanced.
Instead, most meals will take place here.
Everyone is dining al fresco this year.
Absolutely. Whenever possible, we are going to be outside.
And for bedtime, campers keep to their pods in cabins and tents. These precautions will not be unique to Trailblazers. They're following the national guidance of the American Camp Association.
In this pandemic summer, camp is even more essential. These children have been anxious and isolated and disconnected from each other. The most important thing that we learned last summer was to be consistent and diligent.
He says the organization's 12,000 member camps across the country are working together to make sure this year's campers get to run, paddle, and soar outdoors safely in a year when they need it most.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.